Good morning, good afternoon, and hello, everybody joining us today for a discussion about modern day anti-slavery. And my name is Dr. Caroline Schroeder, and I am one of the organizers of Douglass Week. And I'm here with my colleague and co-organizer of Douglass Week, Dr. Adrian Mulligan from Bucknell University. Adrian.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for joining us today, everybody. So we're delighted to welcome you to the second annual Douglass Week. It's a wide-ranging celebration of the great abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, as well as other change makers.
And our aim is not only to celebrate Douglass with Douglass Week, but also to emphasize the importance of remembering slavery and the intertwined struggle for liberation in Ireland and the US and really around the world. And we are also here to talk to you about, all the many very contemporary related topics that come up when you do talk about Frederick Douglass.
Absolutely, yeah. We're thinking here too, about the fact that slavery isn't something of the past. And unfortunately, we've still got it with us. And I think if Frederick Douglass was here today, he'd be the first to point this out. So we're honored today to have Lizzie Muir from Anti-Slavery International, who's going to talk to us about modern day slavery. Thank you so much, Lizzie, for joining us, and a very warm welcome to Douglass Week.
Oh, thank you both. It's a pleasure to be with you both. Yeah. So, shall we begin?
Let's begin.
We're very much looking forward to your talk, Lizzie, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions afterwards. So if you want to share your screen, we are very excited about your presentation.
Well, it's wonderful to be here with you all. It's an honor to come and talk on such an important topic. So I am from Anti-Slavery International, and we work across the world and in the UK to fight modern slavery. And I thought I'd start by just talking a little bit about Frederick Douglass himself. So he was born in 1817 or 1818. We're not exactly sure the exact year, but he was born to his mother, who was a slave, and a father who was white. And we think that he might have been his mother's owner. He escaped slavery in 1888. Quote, he said, "I lived more in one day than in a year of my slave life." He had to catch a ship and then travel by foot and then another ship, I believe, to get to New York to escape his owners. And after settling in Massachusetts, he became a leading abolitionist. He worked with William Lloyd Garrison, Martin Delany, and Abraham Lincoln, trying to fight for freedom for everyone. And in 1845, he published his first book and his most well-known book, which was the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. So if you didn't know much about him, he is one of the leaders of the abolition movement in the 1800s. He is a pioneer, and he was well ahead of his time in fighting for the freedom of enslaved people in America. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that we work across the world, but we were founded in 1839. So while Frederick Douglass was fighting for freedom in the States, we had the abolition in 1807 in the UK. And so in 1839, a group of 12 abolitionists came together and said, slavery is still happening in the world and we need to fight against it. And this was coming up to 22 years after the original Abolition Act. And so we are a UK-based charity. We work to eliminate all different forms of modern slavery, and we deal with the root causes of slavery. It's not just about patching up what's happening, it's about working out what causes slavery. And we would argue that there are three causes of slavery today. There's poverty, discrimination, and weak rules and laws. And so we work to combat all three of those different things. So we touched on the fact that there was slavery in the 1800s, as you should know, but slavery didn't end during the transatlantic slave trade. In fact, it just began. So we would say that someone is in slavery today if they are owned by another person who controls where they live and work. And they can be forced or coerced, they are treated as an object, they are owned or controlled by an employer, and there's no freedom of movement. And to give you an idea of the scale of modern slavery today, so over the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade, it was estimated that there were 12 to 12.8 million people enslaved. Today, it is 40.3 million people. So slavery has evolved. It's not just transporting people across the Atlantic Ocean. It's not just forced labor. It has gone into many different forms, and it is now ingrained in many different aspects and areas of our lives. So I wanted to start by asking you all to think, you who are listening, where your cotton is from. Now, I have a jumper with me, and it's a lovely green jumper. I don't know if you can see because of the background. And on the label of my jumper, it tells me where it was made. It tells me how to wash my jumper, what it's made of, but it doesn't actually tell me where the cotton used to make my lovely soft green jumper comes from. And this is really important because where our clothes come from, we need to be absolutely certain that modern slavery is not used in the creation of our clothes. So I just wanted to touch on cotton crimes in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. So cotton is a commodity that is used not just in the garment industry, but in the fabrics industry and across the world in many different areas. And Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan use repressive governments their repressive governments used forced labor on a massive scale. So both countries export a vast majority of cotton, and it ends up in global supply chains. So they are two of the world's largest exporters in cotton. And in fact, Uzbekistan is the 6th largest producer of cotton today. And so what they do is for a few weeks every year, they force their populations to leave their jobs. So schools close, hospitals close, doctor surgery closed, and they're forced to go to these fields and pick cotton. They're not given any protective equipment or gear. If they say no, they either have to pay a massive fine, or they will be put in prison and face unemployment. And the money used, the money gained from these cotton harvests goes into the pockets of the elite. So it's a very corrupt system. And so right at the start of the cotton industry, we have forced labor, we have modern slavery. So has this forced labor been used to make my green jumper? Well, I don't know, because it doesn't tell me where the cotton is from. And just to quote a student from Uzbekistan, he said, "You work like a slave from morning till night. There is not enough food. We sleep and we wake up hungry again. This is inhumane. They are being controlled." So think about what it means for someone to be enslaved. They are forced to work. They are owned or controlled. They are treated like an object, and they are not allowed to have freedom of movement. So it's quite clear that modern slavery is happening here. It's not just happening at the very start of the supply chain. Modern slavery happens throughout. And many of you might remember Rana Plaza. So in 2013, just after 8 a.m., an 8-story commercial building collapsed in Bangladesh, and it killed just over 1,000 people and injured about 2,500. The day before, the building had been evacuated because they had found cracks in the foundations. And the owners of the factories threatened to withhold 1 month's salary of workers who didn't come to work the next day. And so here we have people who are going forced, not just to work in a factory where they're not being paid a lot of money, there'll be children working here, but also they're being told that their salaries will be withheld. They're being coerced to work in unsafe working conditions. And so those who did come in, very sadly, this incident happened that morning. And brands including Prada, Gucci, Versace, Mango, Matalan, and Primark all had their apparel made here. And what's really interesting is auditors came to Rana Plaza and actually held it up as an example of, here is a factory that doesn't use modern slavery, when actually it does, and it did. And so often when an auditor will go and look at a factory they'll have a lot of warning, the factory owners, and they'll make everything look crystal clear. And so it makes modern slavery very easily hidden, because they can prepare to make all of their workers look as though they're being treated well, when actually that's not the case. And so we have modern slavery found during the cotton harvest at the very start, during the creating of the apparel in Bangladesh. But then we also have it on our doorsteps. So as you can tell, I'm from the UK. And up in Leicester, which is in the north of England, in 2020, Labour Behind the Label found that there were staff being paid £3.50 an hour, bearing in mind that the national minimum wage is £9.30 in the UK. And it was estimated that there were roughly 10,000 victims of forced labour in these factories. So it also happens on our doorsteps. It's not just in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan and Bangladesh. It's happening in the UK. This is happening on our doorsteps, and we need to be aware about it. So it's really important that we know where not just the cotton our clothes come from, but where every single material in our clothes, in the products we use, come from, in the food we eat, in everyday items that we use, the metals used in our phones, even solar panels. The solar panel industry has been found to use forced labor from the Uyghur region in China to create polysilicon, polygrade silicon. So it's really important that we know if modern slavery is used in what we're buying. And I just wanted to touch on what we do at Anti-Slavery International to end cotton crime. So we have had over 250 businesses pledge to not knowingly use Uzbek cotton. And so brands such as H&M, Nike, also M&S are also working to remove it from their supply chains. And actually, we've seen massive improvement in Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is now really decreasing the amount of forced labor used. And we're now turning our efforts more to Turkmenistan, which seems to be increasing forced labor in the country. We also campaign against the World Bank and the EU from financing Uzbek agricultural projects. So that's a bit of the work we do. So you might be wondering, well, what does modern slavery look like today if it doesn't look like what it did during the transatlantic slave trade? And so there are 7 types of modern slavery. So we have domestic servitude. So domestic workers will perform a range of tasks in private homes, including cooking, cleaning, laundry, looking after children, elderly relatives. Often the pay is very low and they work very long hours, and the wages are paid infrequently. And then there's forced and child marriage, which is fairly self-explanatory, but it's when you're forced to marry someone against your will, and child marriage is if you are under the age of marital consent in the country that you live in. But also many countries don't actually have laws in place to protect children from marriage. So anyone from under the age of 16, we would say, is being forced into child marriage. There's also forced labour, so it's any work or service in which you're forced to do against your will under threat of punishment. And then there is child slavery. It's often confused with child labour, but we need to be really clear on the language we use when we talk about modern slavery. So child labour is slightly different. Child slavery involves exploitation. To give you an example, you might be in child labour if your parents are ill and you go to work to pay their medical fees, and you get a wage at the end of the day, and you go home, you give it to your parents and they can pay for, their medicine. Child slavery would be your parents might be ill, they might not be, but you are forced to go and work, you don't get any wages, and you're sent home with nothing to take home. You miss out on an education, which dramatically decreases your chances of earning a living when you're older. So it involves exploitation for someone else's gain. And then there is human trafficking. Often people equate human trafficking to sex trafficking, but specifically it involves the recruitment, the harboring and the transportation of people into situations of exploitation. And they'll do this through the use of violence, deception and coercion. And that includes sex trafficking, it includes drug trafficking, but it also includes organ harvesting. Then we have bonded and debt labour. So this is when someone takes out a loan or a debt, and to pay back that debt, they are forced to work against their will. And finally, there is descent-based slavery. So people today are still born into slavery, just like they were during the transatlantic slave trade. It's mostly caused by historical oppression. So it could be because their ancestors many centuries ago were captured into slavery, and so families have belonged to slave owning families ever since. It's really important to note that often these will cross over and someone will be a victim of more than one form of modern slavery. So you could be a child who is being forced to work to pay off a debt. So you'd be a victim of child slavery, debt labor, and forced labor in that situation. I'm just going to pause there, Caroline, because I think my laptop might run out of battery. So I'm just going to plug it in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lizzie, for the talk so far. I think it's very, even though, you know, Adrian and myself, we have both been, you know, working in a different but related field for a long time. But it's, you know, I'm more of a 19th century scholar, which is, you know, it's so interesting to see that one question really hit it home for me. You know, where's your cotton from? There's so much we still, you know, we're not even aware of, even though we're like often, you know, we talk and we think and reflect on all of these things, and we are trying to be very aware and conscious. But I think it's really interesting to see, Lizzie, the things that you've pointed out. And I think especially people watching today might also not be aware of the many different forms of slavery. You know, enslavement in the 19th century, you know, when I see the visuals, it didn't look very much different, obviously, because, you know, different centuries, but like some of these visuals that you've shown are so reminiscent of some of the, you know, slave narratives that I've read and that I've seen, and some of the pictures. And it's, yeah, it's been very insightful so far. So thank you so much. And please continue, Lizzie.
Oh, thank you. Well, I just wanted to give one example of how these forms intersect using a case study. So there was a boy called Hai from Vietnam, and he grew up in a small village and he didn't go to school. And when his father died, he tried to make a living by selling bottles for recycling. And one day, a man approached him and said he could earn a lot of money in Europe. And so if he raised thousands of dollars, this agent would take him. And so his mother took out a loan, they remortgaged the house, and his uncle raised the rest. And after 14 months of traveling, Hai was left at a rest stop or a service station in England. He met another Vietnamese man who took him up to Scotland. But he was told that he now owed more money for the journey than originally told, plus interest. And to pay this off, he would be forced to water cannabis. He wouldn't be able to send money to his mother and sisters until he paid it off. And he did ask if he could work at a restaurant instead, as promised, but they said this was his only option. They also said if he went to the police would arrest him and beat him up and send him home. And so they left him alone in this house with instructions. They locked the doors. They would turn up every few days with water and food. Anytime he would ask if he could go home, he was beaten. And this went on for 3 months until the police, the UK police, raided the house, and he was arrested and taken into custody. When he was asked questions, he was extremely confused and he was very scared. He didn't understand, and his solicitor advised him to plead guilty. So he was 15 years old and he pled guilty, and he was sentenced to 24 months in an adult prison and was told he would be deported after he served his sentence. So here you can see child slavery, forced labor, debt bondage, and human trafficking. And to think in those 14 months of traveling, if one person had thought, ooh, this doesn't feel right, maybe I should say something. If only that had happened, he wouldn't have experienced this. But also it goes to show you that even governments who are meant to protect victims of modern slavery aren't protecting them. And there's a lot more that needs to be done. I thought I would quickly touch on modern slavery in the States and in the UK. So there's estimated to be about 400,000 people living in modern slavery. So it's about 1.26 per thousand people. But it's often understood that is a lot more. Modern slavery is very hidden. It's hard to find, it's hard to spot. And actually, if you do proper estimations, it will be wildly above that, as we'll see in the UK. So Polaris, which is a charity that does research into modern slavery, analysed about 32,000 cases of human trafficking documented between 2007 and 2016. So it's 32,000 over a span of 9 years. But also in the US, victim support services are not always available for victims. They will often be very gender specific. So if you are a male and you're a victim of modern slavery, you may not be able to access what you need. And penalties also vary for perpetrators, from fines to life imprisonment. So there's not really a deterrent to not participate in modern slavery. And finally, foreign victims can be detained and deported for immigration violations. So victims of modern slavery who have been treated as criminals for conduct that occurred whilst under the control of their oppressors could be forced, could be deported or put into prison. So it really doesn't provide any support for victims who've been coerced into carrying out illicit activities. And it's very much the same in the UK. So in the UK, the government estimates that there are about 13,000 people living in modern slavery. However, the Global Slavery Index, which is a fantastic tool to use if you're wanting to learn more about this, says it's closer to 130,000 people. So it's a huge difference. So that's 2.1 per 1,000 people. So in 2018, there are about 7,000 people referred to the UK authorities as potential victims of slavery. About 57% were in labour exploitation, 27% were in sexual exploitation, and 45% were children. 7% were in domestic servitude. And also it's important to highlight that heart organ harvesting is an issue as well. I don't know how many of you have watched Squid Game, the series on Netflix, but a subplot of that involves organ harvesting. And in the UK in 2018, 6 people were trafficked for organ harvesting, and it's very much kept under the radar. So before we move on to spotting the signs of modern slavery, I wanted to touch on what we do in the UK. So the Modern Slavery Act was passed in 2015, and it combines years of efforts. It combines years and years of effort and different charities working to tackle existing slavery and trafficking offences. So it's established an independent anti-slavery commissioner, which encourages good practice. It also provides mechanisms for seizing traffickers' assets and channeling some of that money towards victim compensation, which is a really fantastic thing to do. It also allows, it sort of creates, companies are now asked to carry out work on their supply chain. It's sort of suggested that they do this. It's not specifically a company must carry out due diligence, but it's very much heavily advised, and that is an error in it. So it does allow companies to hide supply chain abuses overseas. So as long as goods they produce don't end up in Britain, if a company, if their headquarters are in the UK, but the goods they produced are with modern slavery, but end up in another country, then it doesn't prosecute that company. And it also means that British citizens can abuse victims overseas and not be held accountable. We also host the Anti-Trafficking Monitoring Group, which is a coalition of 18 UK-based anti-trafficking organisations, and we monitor the UK's implementation of this act, and we lobby them when we don't think they're doing a brilliant job. There's a bill currently in session called the Nationality and Borders Bill in the UK, which is going to be very, very detrimental to victims of modern slavery who have had to participate in illicit activities. And so the ATMG are very heavily fighting against that bill. So I wanted to touch on what some of the signs of modern slavery are, so that you listening can start to look out for them. As we mentioned, there's those 14 months of high travelling from Vietnam to the UK. If only someone had spotted how he was acting, and if only someone could have said something. So someone might be in slavery if they appear to be under control of someone or reluctant to interact with others, if they don't have any personal identification on them. So often people's passports and visas are withheld until they expire, so then they become an illegal immigrant. Or they have no longer got the right to remain in the country, and so then they can't really go to the police and say, could you help me? Because the first thing the police will say is, where's your proof that you can see here in this country. So those are often withheld from them. So look out if someone doesn't have any ID. They'll have very few personal belongings, so they'll often wear the same clothes, or the clothes might be unsuitable for the work they do. So if they're working on a building site, they may not be wearing protective gear. They won't be able to move around freely, so they won't be able to go down to the corner shop. They'll also be dropped off and collected from work at very strange, unusual hours of the night. So it could be very early in the morning or very late at night, and it will always be in the same way. It will be repetitive. And they'll, of course, appear frightened and withdrawn, and they might show signs of physical or psychological abuse. So these are all signs of someone in modern slavery. And if you think you've spotted someone who might be a potential victim of modern slavery in the UK, you can call the Modern Slavery Helpline. They have brilliant resources. I'm not sure who you would call in the USA. There's a great charity called Free the Slaves, who I would contact if you're worried about someone. But yeah. So finally, what you can do, it's all very well me sort of talking about the problems, but there are things that you could do. So you could tell people what you've learned today. You could share any information, any statistics you've learned. You could research companies that you buy from and make sure that their supply chains are free from modern slavery, or that they're doing their best and that they're trying. You could donate to us, even as little as £5 or $5 really goes a long way. And finally, you could fundraise. If there are students out there, you can get some students together. If you're a member of a local community group, you could ask them to think about doing a fundraising bake sale or a running challenge. There are so many different things you can do. But yeah, that concludes my presentation. And I would be delighted, Caroline and Adrian, if you had any questions.
We do. Thank you so much, Lizzie. And super quick, I just typed into Google there, Modern Slavery Hotline USA, and straight away, National Tip Hotline, Human Trafficking Hotlines, National Hotlines, so some of them maybe more aligned with sort of government stuff, some more sort of NGO stuff. So again, here, like with everything with this, there's things that the information, if we want to go there, the information is at our fingertips. I'm thinking about how long we spend on our phones all day doing all kinds of crazy things, when this information about this kind of horrific stuff and what we can do about it is way easier to get a hold of if we're able to try to conceptualize it. So yeah, I mean, I suppose that's one of the first questions I have here, which is people watching this, and I know that this is quite common, with the world is just so complex and there's just so many things going on, and everything you buy has, if you think about it for a second, has 50 million different people involved in it with 50 million different places. It can seem so complex, even though it's disturbing. But it's all too easy to be like, I just don't know where to start. It's just little old me against the world. What difference am I gonna make, really? And then it's all too easy to not do anything because you just feel relatively powerless. But again, here for our audience, what are some of the things that you might be able to reiterate of what we can do, even in a small way, in our neighborhoods or in our towns or in our schools or our universities? It might be that big, it might just be us, but what kinds of things can we begin to do ourselves? Because obviously a groundswell can begin to pick up here.
Yeah, of course. I think the first thing you could do is look for petitions. So often we have a lot of petitions to the UK government, but I'm sure there will be petitions to the US, to the Irish government, to the EU. So we currently have one asking for the UK government to hold businesses accountable for modern slavery in their supply chains and to do due diligence. So that's the first thing you can do. It's really easy as well. You can just search modern slavery campaign country and just sign it. It's free. So it's the first thing you can do. The second thing I would recommend is looking up the companies that you buy your products from and seeing what they are doing. They will often have a modern slavery statement on their website, but often it's a tick box exercise, and they're simply having it to show, look at us, we're thinking about modern slavery. You really want to see, are they showing their suppliers? Are they telling you their supply chain? Are they going right down into the depths of their product and how it is made? A good organization to look at is Know the Chain. So they show lots of different companies and they will give them a score on what they're doing. There's also a really good app called Giki, spelt Giki, and it's in the UK. I'm not sure if it's in Ireland or the US, but you can scan a barcode on a product that you have, and it will give you a score, and it will tell you a bit more about how sustainable it is, but also is modern slavery used in the production of it that we know of. There is also the Global Slavery Index, which will highlight countries and what they're doing. So if you know that Turkmenistan uses forced labor in cotton production, you can say, okay, well, when I'm looking to buy clothes, I want to make sure that I'm not buying them from companies that get their cotton from Turkmenistan, or I'm not going to buy clothes from Turkmenistan. Spotting the signs, as I mentioned, is a huge thing. Often victims don't really know what to do, and I think it's really crucial to say, if you do think someone is a victim of modern slavery, don't approach them. You will most likely cause them more harm than good if you approach them. It's really important to call that hotline that you mentioned, Adrian, or one in your own country, and ask them for their advice, or alert the authorities and see if they can help. You can also write to companies and sort of, I mean, we never call on boycotts at Anti-Slavery International, but you can certainly write to them and say, as a consumer, I'm using my consumer power to shop elsewhere until you can, you know, show me that you're taking proactive steps in this. So I would say those are some small steps you can do. Also, just sharing what you've learned with friends and family, telling them what are some signs. Friends who maybe might be working in jobs where they might encounter someone living in modern slavery more often, that can be really helpful for them to be aware. But I would say those are good places to start. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. I think that there's a lot of starting points there, and I think it's you know, we have audiences from around the world watching today, and I think it's you know, I think it's a really good exercise to, you know, look at some of the websites or the apps that you mentioned. I'm thinking of Slavery Footprint as well, for example, where, you know, I think it's like you mentioned, you know, the awareness, because we can't spot the signs if we don't know what the signs are, and we can't force or ask companies to change things if we don't know what's involved. You know, you're explaining the, you know, the process, and from the cotton crimes to, you know, the final product at Prada or whoever, and, you know, often we're not aware of that. So thank you for all of those tips, Lizzie. I wanted to just kind of follow up on what Adrian said there about I'm thinking especially about educators, schools. You know, with Douglass Week, we're trying to also really in specific reach a younger audience as well, and I'm just wondering about universities and schools. It doesn't matter if in the UK, Ireland, the US, or anywhere else. Is there anything in particular that students can do or that educators can do?
Absolutely, that's a brilliant question, Caroline. And more and more I'm being approached by schools wanting me to come and talk to their students about modern slavery. So I think the first thing is education, teaching young people what is modern slavery, what is happening in the world that they are growing up in. I mean, this is the next generation of leaders. People are going to become leaders of corporations, CEOs and politicians, and it's really important that they know these issues are happening and they're not just brushed under the rug. So firstly, education. Secondly, I would say it's really brilliant if you can get a club or a society together that looks at these issues. So we have a few different societies at universities around the UK, and we're looking into one with the US university as well, US college. So getting a society together who can hold awareness events, but also fundraisers. Fundraisers are really fun, not just for you to take on a challenge, but also, again, they teach people about the topic. You can tell your mum, oh, Mum, I'm doing a 10K run for Anti-Slavery International. Oh, what's that? And you get to start that conversation. And I already mentioned campaigning, but also writing to MPs. You can get school classes and university students to write to their MPs. It's really impactful coming from a school as well. The MPs were much more likely to reply from a group of young students really caring about an issue than to just one constituent. So that's also a really brilliant thing you can do. Yeah, I would say those are the main points. Thank
you, Lizzie. Another question we have here, sort of, I hate to say this, but there seems to be sort of a dominant argument out there associated with ideas of economic development as well. But like, slavery is just necessary evil. It's just how you become developed. We all went through it. You got to go through it too, as if somehow these countries exist back in time. But they exist in the present moment. We're interconnected to them. But what do you say to that argument, that people are like, well, it's terrible, but you know, good times are coming?
Yeah, I would firstly say, just because something is the way it is doesn't mean that's how it should be. You know, it's a terrible thing. Imagine your brother or your niece or your mother or your friend being in the conditions that we said. I mean, if you have any 15-year-olds in your life, imagine they are high traveling from Vietnam to the UK, and how terrifying that must be. I think human decency, you know, if you don't have to think about it long to realize that this is wrong. And actually it is possible to have slavery-free supply chains. That is possible. There are many organizations and companies out there that are working hard to make sure that's the case, or already have that as the case. So it's not impossible. And, you know, modern slavery is built on exploitation, and exploitation is wrong. If we want the world we live in and for our children to grow up in to be one of human decency and humanity, then we need to stand up to this and we need to stop this. If we could make the transatlantic slave trade, if we could abolish that, and of course modern slavery still happened afterwards, but we can do more. You know, if it's been done before, it can happen today with all these different forms of modern slavery. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, I think that what you did in your presentation today, I think, you know, Adrian mentioned it earlier, you know, we talk a lot about Frederick Douglass during Douglass Week, and about other change makers and abolitionists, male and female and other, and we, you know, it's really, you did a really good job showing their relevance today. I think, you know, like we said earlier, slavery is not, or enslavement is not an archaic concept that just exists in the past. And I think, you know, you pointed out the different forms of slavery, but also the, you know, how omnipresent it is. And that's, I guess, one of my other questions to you, Lizzie, is you mentioned the UK, you mentioned the US, you mentioned Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. And I'm sort of thinking about, you know, so many active people, modern day abolitionists like yourself, and you mentioned other organizations. I'm thinking, like, what else is happening in, say, in Europe, because I know we have audience members from Europe as well. What's happening outside of the UK? What's happening outside the US and other countries you mentioned? Is this as relevant?
Absolutely. There will be modern slavery found in every country in the world. It is not something that is just, you know, the global south. It's not just happening in Uzbekistan or the UK or Bangladesh. It's happening in every country in the world. And although we focus on 10 different countries, you know, we have links with every single country. It's really important that you don't think that this is just an issue that's happening far away. It will be on your doorstep, and it's really important to recognize that. But in the EU, our focus specifically is on business and human rights. So we're trying to get the EU and EU-based businesses to stop supporting Uyghur forced labor in China. That's one of our main projects that we do, because that's a huge issue. But also in the EU, you will see different forms of modern slavery. So there will often be human trafficking. People will take advantage of refugees and illegal immigrants coming in, forcing them to work in farms. So there was an incident in Greece where people were being forced to pick strawberries in fields. You don't need to look far to realize that it's happening, you know, everywhere. Yeah, I think in terms of what you can do if you are in those countries, is I would look up local charities that are based in those countries that work there. So there will be Irish-based anti-slavery charities and many more as well in the EU and Europe. So I would say look those up, see if you can help them in any way, see what they suggest. Do they have their own campaigns running? Are they looking for volunteers that you can volunteer your time with? We're always looking for volunteers, so if anyone ever wants to volunteer, do contact us. But it's a global issue, it's not just in the UK. Yeah.
I was really struck there today, pointing out that as we think about Frederick Douglass in the 19th century, he escaped the slave-holding sort of southern states, and he got to the north, and that was a difficult journey enough in itself. But he experienced a lot of racism in the north, even once he was there. But he was still free to speak. There were fugitive slave laws, and he eventually left the United States to get to the United Kingdom of, back then it was United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. But in many ways, he was still free to speak. You know, you mentioned, you know, that these folks today are criminalized. You're going to get deported. You got to keep your head down. You're certainly not going to begin to speak out about something. Douglass too, of course, could travel to the United Kingdom as an asylum seeker and walk straight into to the country at that particular point in time without all the documentation that's needed, without doing it in the back of a truck or having to be smuggled in. You just walk straight in. You realize how different the world is, you know, today in terms of nation states being locked down as compared to the past, where this freedom of movement was. And again, it comes back to organizations such as your one, that we really, you know, need you folks to be sort of raising the voice of these people, and also too, giving regular sort of citizens and consumers a really sort of important sort of venue to sort of amplify the voice here. So thank you so much, Lizzie.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lizzie, from my side as well, and from the entire Douglass Week team. I think that, like Adrian said, you know, we haven't covered half of everything that we would love to talk to you about, and hopefully for Douglass Week 2023, we'll continue this conversation and throughout the year until then. And you know, there's so many related topics that we need to discuss, that we need to talk about, that our audiences probably want to, you know, speak about, and also that we would love for people to reflect on. And so thank you so much for giving this impulse, for, you know, giving some inspiration and some, you know, tips that people can actually do, and very practical instructions on how everyone can actually do, you know, their part in helping the modern day anti-slavery movement. So thank you so much, Lizzie Muir from Anti-Slavery International. Thank you so much for the conversation today.
Oh,
Thank you.